Jake sat in the comfortable chair of the plane, trying to calm his nerves after the long journey. How many years had it been since he was home? Months? Or perhaps years? The war had left deep scars, and although he had already been demobilized, the feeling of anxiety never left him. But now on this plane, he had one goal: to return to his family, to those who were waiting for him at home. This flight was his promised calm after the storm. If only the flight attendant didn't approach him with such a cold look. She was in uniform, her precise movements showing experience, but something in her demeanor made him uneasy. She didn't look him in the eye when she asked him the first question. The wind outside was drawing half circles on the glass, and her words seemed mechanical. "How can I help you? What would you like to drink?" Jake calmed himself, but his inner resolve cracked from her cold attitude. He, like everyone else on board, was just a passenger, and yet her bold look seemed to try to belittle him. He couldn't tell if it was just her habit with passengers or if there was something more to it. "Tea, please," he replied calmly, avoiding the flight attendant's gaze. She didn't say anything and left, leaving him with memories of those terrible days at the front. The sound of her high heels grew fainter, but an uncomfortable silence lingered in the air. A few minutes later, she returned, holding a cup of tea. All her movements were as though she viewed him as just another passenger, not worthy of attention. When she handed him the cup, her eyes skimmed over him as if he were an inanimate object, and he felt something snap inside him. Her attitude was as if he were just a shadow she didn't want to acknowledge. "Here you go," she said, and even her voice sounded emotionless, like a sample service, not genuine care. Jake thanked her, but his inner tension didn't subside. What was it about people's cold attitude? Was it just the usual professional distance, or did she view him as something foreign, something disapproved? He drank his tea, reflecting. Outside the window it was all clouds, but it was merely the backdrop to his inner dialogue. All those years of war, loss, pain, none of it ever went unnoticed. He had become someone else, and even his old, shadowed gaze had changed. And perhaps that's why the flight attendant's attitude struck him so deeply. If he had been like the other passengers, just a man in a suit or a woman in a dress, would her reaction have been the same? He placed the cup on the holder and sighed deeply, trying not to focus on the unpleasant irritation that had arisen within him. But it was there, and he couldn't shake the feeling. Jake tried to immerse himself in his thoughts, attempting to forget the cold attitude of the flight attendant. But when he returned to his seat, he noticed that she seemed to be approaching him again. This time, her steps were even more determined, and her expression more stony. She passed by the other passengers as if she didn't notice them, and her gaze met his again. There was something unfriendly in her eyes, and it irritated him more than anything else. "Aren't you planning to fasten your seatbelt?" she asked, standing in front of him and not even trying to hide the contempt in her voice. Jake felt his inner world, which had been calmly assembled after years of hardship, beginning to crack. She spoke to him as if he had no right to comfort or even attention. "I'm already fastened," he replied calmly, trying not to be provoked. But the flight attendant didn't stop. She didn't even take a step back, remaining standing, watching him. Her gaze once again fell on his beard, his baggy pants, and his old boots, everything he had hastily put on before the flight. She clearly couldn't ignore his appearance. "Excuse me, but could you look a little more presentable? This isn't very proper for a business-class passenger," she said sharply, and her voice carried the same disdain as her look. Jake raised his eyes to her, trying to remain calm. It was so obvious that she wasn't paying attention to anyone else but him, the veteran. Maybe it was her personal bias against people who didn't look like successful passengers, or maybe it was simply an expression of cruelty towards those who, in her view, didn't deserve respect. "I'm going home," Jake said in a soft but firm voice. "And I don't care how I look." The flight attendant didn't respond, but her smile was cold and ironic. She slightly curled her lips and walked away, without stopping. All these little mocking, unfriendly details seemed too obvious, too real to Jake. He didn't need to think much to understand that her attitude wasn't accidental. She treated him like someone who had no right to comfort, like a person not worth respecting. Jake tried to find calm again, returning to his thoughts, but her behavior remained in his mind. His hands lightly clenched the armrests of the chair. It was an injustice he had seen many times in his life. He wasn't one of those people who was used to tolerating humiliation. But now in this situation, he decided to remain calm and not fall for the provocation. But after a few minutes, the flight attendant returned once again. And this time, her words were even more rude. "You know the rules on board clearly state that passengers must look appropriate according to the standards." She stood in front of him again, this time leaning in so that her face was very close to his. "I would advise you to pay attention to that if you want to be respected." Jake felt something flare up inside him. He couldn't believe this woman was behaving this way just because of his appearance. A war veteran, someone who had gone through hell, didn't deserve such treatment. But he didn't want to react emotionally. He knew that any aggression would only confirm her prejudice. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly, looking her in the eyes. "But I'm not looking for your respect. I just want to get home." The flight attendant looked at him for a few more seconds, but then just walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Jake felt his heart beat faster. He didn't know if this situation had a continuation, or if it was just the first step toward something bigger. But he was ready to stand his ground, even if it meant facing her disdain. A few minutes after the stewardess left Jake in peace, he felt his mood lighten slightly. She had disappeared from his sight, and the surroundings seemed a little quieter. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was being weighed down by her cruelty. He tried to return to his thoughts, to distract himself from the situation, but it wasn't working. Several times he tried to close his eyes, but then her face appeared again. Her gaze, her words. She was like the embodiment of everything he despised. If only he could respond to her the way he wanted, without any restrictions. But he didn't have time for that. He was here not to settle scores. Suddenly, the stewardess returned to his row. This time, she was holding a menu card and had a smile that looked much less convincing. In her hands was a glass of water. "Sorry for the earlier misunderstanding," she said, trying to appear polite, but he could tell it was nothing more than a formality. "May I offer you something from our menu?" Jake looked at her, and this time his expression remained calm. He didn't fall for her attempt to soften the atmosphere. "I'm not hungry, thank you," he said quietly. The stewardess fell silent for a few seconds, her lips pressed together, but she didn't walk away. In her eyes, there was a moment of nervousness, as if she were trying to figure out what to do next, but she couldn't quite decide. "Are you all right?" she asked, leaning slightly forward. "I'm fine," he replied again, trying not to give her any more chances to invade his space. She didn't say anything more, just took a step back and left him alone. Jake felt something shift inside him. Now he understood that these small, toxic moments the stewardess created really did have the power to affect his emotions. And although he was trying to remain calm, he felt that this situation would no longer be the same as before. A few minutes later, another passenger approached his row, a young man who had been sitting a few seats away. He looked a little nervous, but when he saw Jake, he smiled in surprise. "You didn't fly on that flight from Chicago, right?" "I remember you," he said. Jake couldn't immediately place the guy, but he nodded. "Maybe," he replied reluctantly. "I saw you on the news." "You're the veteran who saved the team in Vietnam, right?" the young man asked, somewhat excitedly. Jake didn't respond immediately, unsure how to react. He didn't want to be recognized for those moments of fame, but the guy was genuinely interested. So he just smiled and nodded. "It was a long time ago," he said, trying to change the subject. The young man seemed to understand that now wasn't the time for questions, so he just stepped back and wished him a good flight. Jake was left alone again. But despite the outside world trying to adjust to his presence, this new moment, recognition, only intensified the inner conflict that had started to heal after his encounter with the stewardess. He once again felt like an outsider. An outsider among the passengers on this plane, an outsider among those who were just traveling, relaxing, not carrying the heavy memories that affected his everyday. Meanwhile, the stewardess was approaching his row again, and this time her gaze wasn't as harsh. She silently walked past, but this time it seemed there was something more in her eyes than just disdain. Jake realized that his appearance would still remain a point of tension for her. She would try again to fix him, but this time he wouldn't let her words break his calm. When the flight attendant left him again, Jake felt the atmosphere on the plane shift. He tried to collect his thoughts when, unexpectedly, a man sat next to him. Jake didn't expect to meet anyone so unusual, and was surprised to see none other than Morgan Freeman sitting before him. Yes, the legendary actor, whose face was one of the most recognizable in Hollywood. Morgan smiled when he saw the surprise on Jake's face. "You look like someone used to surprises," he said quietly but confidently. "But trust me, this will be the biggest of them." At first, Jake didn't understand what was happening, but then he looked at the man more closely. It really was Morgan Freeman, with his distinct voice and charisma that was impossible to ignore. He couldn't believe he was on the same plane as such a celebrity. "This can't be," Jake muttered. Morgan Freeman took off his glasses and smiled, turning his attention back to Jake. "Yes, it's me," he confirmed, still smiling. "But I'm not just an actor, Jake. I'm also the owner of this plane, and I see you're not very comfortable. What do you say we change your travel experience?" Jake understood something strange was going on, but his mind couldn't immediately grasp the full picture. "Are you kidding?" he asked, trying to figure out what was behind this man's words. Morgan Freeman smiled again, his voice softer but more confident. "No, I'm serious. I have a VIP section on board where you can enjoy comfort. No more worrying about little things like rude flight attendants," he said, gesturing toward where the flight attendant had just been. Jake began to doubt whether he was losing his mind. Just as he started questioning whether this could be true, Morgan stood up, helped him out of his seat, and led him through the cabin. Just a few minutes later, they were in a separate part of the plane, where the space looked incredibly comfortable, a large soft seating area, away from the other passengers, with panoramic windows offering breathtaking views. "This is a real VIP lounge," Morgan explained as he sat in a comfortable chair and gestured for Jake to do the same. "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked, sitting next to him. His heart was racing from the surprise, but he sensed there was something more behind it. Morgan Freeman leaned forward slightly, and his expression became serious. "I noticed you right away. You're not just a veteran, Jake. You're someone who has been through a lot of trials. Your eyes, they tell a story that can't be forgotten. And that impresses me. People like you deserve respect, even if others don't understand that," he said, his gaze never leaving Jake. Jake was taken aback. He didn't know what to say, but a warm feeling of gratitude began to fill his heart. Instead of worrying about the flight attendant's rudeness, he now found himself in a completely different reality, one where he was respected, where his experiences weren't just empty memories. "You're right," Jake said, a little embarrassed. "It's all been tough. Sometimes it's hard to hold on when you feel so out of place among people." Morgan nodded and pressed a button that opened a special bar. "Sometimes we need to stop, think, and allow ourselves to rest. You have the chance to forget about it all, even for a few hours," he said, handing Jake a glass of juice. "So enjoy this journey, Jake. This is your time." Jake felt like he had entered an entirely different reality. All the moments of tension and stress were behind him, and now he was simply sitting next to this extraordinary man who had opened new doors for him into a world where his life mattered. Morgan Freeman, watching as Jake began to relax and enjoy the new comfort, turned back to him with a serious expression and continued, Jake, I want to apologize for the behavior of my staff. What happened to you was unacceptable. I don't want you to feel the way you felt at the beginning of this flight. No one has the right to treat people like that, especially someone who's been through what you have. I understand how hard it can be." Jake was surprised by Morgan's words. He hadn't expected such sincerity from someone of his stature. Just a few minutes ago, he still felt like a person who had been looked down upon and humiliated. And now here was someone who not only didn't ignore the situation, but was genuinely trying to make things right. I don't know what to say," Jake replied, processing his words, "but this is important. Not just for me, but for anyone who might find themselves in this situation." Morgan nodded, confirming he understood. "This is exactly what I'm thinking. And I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again. As soon as we land, I'm taking the necessary steps," he added, looking intently at Jake. Morgan leaned forward and raised his hand as if to confirm his seriousness. "I'll fire that flight attendant. She shouldn't be working for my company if she doesn't understand basic principles of humanity and respect. Such behavior has no place on board my planes." Jake hadn't expected this turn of events. At first it seemed like empty words, but from the way Morgan expressed his intentions, it was clear he truly meant to follow through. "This must be hard for you," Jake said, still not quite believing what he was hearing. "But I guess it's the right thing to do." Morgan looked at him and smiled. "Sometimes it's more important to take the right step rather than the convenient one. I respect your wisdom, Jake. And once again, I apologize for everything you've had to go through. I hope this journey brings you more peace." Looking at Morgan, Jake felt more than just gratitude. He felt that a part of the pride and confidence he had long been searching for had been restored. Morgan's words, which might have seemed insignificant to others, had become an important step toward recovering what had been lost. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, and though his voice was calm, there was more emotion in it than he could express. "This means a lot to me. I don't even know what to say." Morgan Freeman smiled again, sensing that the action he was about to take would make a big difference. "Your journey should be pleasant, Jake, and nothing will bother you now." With these words, he stood up, and Jake remained seated in the comfortable chair, feeling that life could indeed be a different reality. The plane smoothly touched down on the ground, and the passengers began gathering their belongings, ready to leave the aircraft. Jake sat in his new, comfortable spot in the VIP section, but one thing kept running through his mind, something that had suddenly come to him. After exiting the plane, he looked at Morgan Freeman, who was approaching him, smiling, and decided to ask the question that had been on his mind throughout the entire flight. "Morgan, I have one more request for you," Jake said, feeling a little nervous, but with all the respect he had for this great man. "I know this might seem strange, but I have a granddaughter. She's a huge fan of yours. She basically grew up watching your films. Would it be possible for us to come to your home so she could meet you?" Morgan Freeman stopped, slightly surprised, but his smile didn't fade. "That's a very interesting request, Jake," he replied, studying the man. "But, I think it could be a great idea. Not every day do people ask me something like this, and I think it could be a meaningful event not just for your granddaughter, but for you as well." Jake looked at him uncertainly. "Are you serious? I just don't want it to seem like an unnecessary intrusion." Morgan raised his hand, preventing him from continuing. "No, Jake, I won't refuse you. If it makes your granddaughter happy, I see no reason to say no. True joy comes from sharing your time with those who are inspired by your work. I'd be happy to meet your granddaughter." Jake couldn't believe his ears. This was more than he could have hoped for. He felt his heart tighten with emotion, and for a moment, his thoughts were interrupted by joy. "Thank you, Morgan. This means so much to me. You have no idea how much happiness this will bring my granddaughter." Morgan Freeman nodded, and together they left the plane, ready to embark on a new, unforgettable stage of their journey, one that promised to be filled with true magic and special moments. As soon as Jake and Morgan left the airport and got into the car, their conversation smoothly shifted from formalities to more personal topics. Jake talked about his family, how difficult it had been for him to return to peaceful life after the war, how every day had been a struggle, but he always found strength through his loved ones. Morgan listened attentively, occasionally offering soothing words of support. "Your granddaughter really loves my films?" Morgan asked, smiling as they sped through the city streets. "Yes," Jake replied. "She's asked me so many times to tell her about you, about your roles. And I always did, of course, but she could never imagine that one day she would meet you in real life. She's going to be absolutely thrilled." Morgan laughed. "I'm sure she'll be no less surprised than you. But in this world, it's important to find moments of joy and make them meaningful for the people who truly care about them." The car stopped at Morgan's luxurious home, which looked even grander in the darkness of the night. The lights of the house bathed the yard in a warm glow, and the garden around it was well maintained and impeccably beautiful. Jake felt like he was in a fairy tale. He never expected his life to take such a sharp turn. Had it not been for the chance encounter on the plane, he would never have imagined that one day he would be heading to Morgan Freeman's home. Morgan got out of the car first and helped Jake out. "I'm glad we met, Jake. It's really nice to help people feel that their journey matters," Morgan said, leading Jake to the door. Once they entered the house, Morgan called into the room where his personal assistant was. "Nina, I want you to prepare some tea for us," he said. "Of course, Mr. Freeman," she responded from the other side of the house. Jake felt uncomfortable, but Morgan quickly noticed his discomfort. "Don't worry, we're not here for formalities. Please relax. Your granddaughter will be here soon, and this should be a celebratory moment." A few minutes later, a little girl appeared at the door. She was about 10 years old, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She saw Jake and didn't immediately understand what was happening. But when her gaze turned to Morgan, her heart burst with joy. Are we really at Morgan Freeman's house?" she asked, looking at Jake with doubt. "Yes, sweetheart, it's true." Jake smiled and nudged her toward Morgan. "Here he is, the one and only Morgan Freeman." Morgan tilted his head, smiling, and extended his hand toward the girl. "Hello, little one. I'm so happy to meet you. I hear you're a big fan of mine." The girl looked ready to explode with happiness, her eyes filled with tears, and she cautiously reached out to him. Morgan hugged her and whispered softly, "I'm glad you admire my work. You probably always thought this was impossible, didn't you?" The girl simply nodded, and her face lit up with an expression of pure joy. She sat next to Morgan, and they began talking about his films, about how he creates his characters. Jake sat nearby, watching them, feeling how important it was to have such moments, simple, but invaluable. It was a moment when he realized that his own journey, his struggle, all those years after the war, really did matter. He had been able to create something more for his loved ones than just memories. He had given them something real, the feeling that, despite all the difficulties, the world was still filled with moments of true happiness. Time passed quickly, and the evening turned into a wonderful gathering, filled with joy and laughter. The little girl was thrilled to meet Morgan Freeman, asking him endless questions about his films, how he became an actor, and even about his personal life. Morgan happily answered, smiling and asking her questions in return, joking to create a light atmosphere. Jake sat nearby, watching this idyllic scene. He felt the pain and anxiety that had always followed him gradually fade away, replaced by a sense of certainty. It was a moment he had never expected. These minutes, sitting in Morgan Freeman's home with his family and the amazing granddaughter. These were not just gifts from fate. This was a chance for a new life. "Jake," Morgan said, pulling him aside while the girl was still discussing something with his assistant. "I want you to know that if you ever need any help, I'm always here. People who have served deserve more than just gratitude. And sometimes a kind word can change everything." Jake looked at him with gratitude in his eyes. Morgan was not just a star on the screen, but a real person, ready to help. This was more than he could have imagined. "Thank you, Morgan," he said quietly, but with deep feeling. "It means a lot to me." The evening ended, and they headed to the car to go back home. Jake turned his gaze back to Morgan, who was smiling at him as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Just two people talking and supporting each other. "Sometimes life gives us such surprises," Jake concluded. "I never imagined this could happen." Morgan agreed. "Life is always ready to offer us new opportunities. We just need to notice them in time." When Jake went home, he felt that the world had changed for him. Maybe now he would look at everything differently, appreciate the small moments of happiness more, and not forget that even in darkness, there is room for light. And his granddaughter, without a doubt, would tell all her friends about that day until she got older, and maybe even remember these moments as a little miracle that truly happened. And so, this extraordinary story about the meeting of two worlds, a war veteran and a Hollywood actor, came to an end. Two people meeting in a difficult moment helped each other find a path to a new beginning.